He stood in the kitchen, the clock ticking louder than usual. Not a word had been spoken in over 30 minutes. Not because there was peace, but because peace had become a performance. Every gesture measured, every breath calculated. When he reached for the glass, his hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the silent pressure of walking through a battlefield with no visible war. This wasn't a rare moment. It was daily life. A life where survival meant silence. In toxic relationships, silence becomes a strategy. Not the kind that offers reflection or healing, but the kind that becomes a shield. You learn to say less, to react slower, to predict moods like a weatherman reading dark skies. And somewhere along the way, you forget that relationships are meant to feel safe. You forget that being yourself shouldn't come at the price of emotional bruises. Stoicism, though ancient, speaks to this exact experience, not as a way to suppress what we feel, but as a way to protect the part of us that still remembers we deserve peace. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." In a relationship where your reality is constantly denied, twisted, or minimized, this teaching is not just wisdom, it's a lifeline. Stoic philosophy teaches that while we can't control others, their moods, their words, their games, we can govern ourselves. That inner mastery becomes survival when the external world feels like a minefield. But it's more than surviving. It's remembering that silence, when chosen freely, is different from silence imposed by fear. The Stoic does not choose silence to appease a tyrant. The Stoic chooses silence because it serves reason, because it creates space to observe, to think, to respond, not react. There's a crucial difference between self-restraint and suppression. The former empowers you, the latter erases you. Seneca warned that no man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. Toxic relationships are adversity in disguise. The daily erosion of self-worth, the gaslighting, the guilt, it's an invisible storm. But it's also an arena, not to fight the other, but to fight for your own clarity. The more you resist the urge to match chaos with chaos, the more you see clearly what belongs to you and what belongs to them. One morning, she sat in the car a full 10 minutes after arriving home, gripping the steering wheel like it was her last anchor to reality. The thought of walking through that door, of bracing for the cold shoulder or the snide remark, made her stomach knot. And then, she remembered something she had read the night before. Epictetus said, "If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation." It didn't excuse the pain, but it gave her a choice. For the first time in weeks, she breathed without panic. Stoicism doesn't teach us to stay in harm's way. It teaches us to recognize harm without becoming it. It teaches us that even when words are used as weapons, we can choose not to be wounded in spirit. We can feel the blow and still stand tall in principle. The toxic person thrives on your reaction, but the Stoic learns that reaction is not owed, it's optional. And in that choice, you begin to reclaim yourself. There's a quiet strength in watching someone try to bait you and choosing not to bite. There's a dignity in not explaining yourself to someone who only listens to refute. That strength, that dignity, it doesn't scream, it doesn't need to. It's a different kind of silence, one that no longer stems from fear, but from alignment with your values. And in that stillness, you begin to hear your own voice again. The path isn't easy. Emotional manipulation distorts reality. It makes you question your memories, your instincts, your worth. But as the Stoics remind us, clarity comes from living in accordance with nature, our true nature. That means trusting what we know in our bones. Love shouldn't make you anxious, and safety shouldn't feel like a reward for good behavior. The first step is awareness, to see that the silence in your relationship isn't peace, it's suppression, that you are not overreacting, that the constant anxiety isn't your fault. Stoicism gives us a language to understand this, not one of passivity, but one of presence. A toxic environment thrives on distortion. The Stoic mindset brings everything back into focus. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight. It's to stop justifying, stop explaining, stop trying to fix what was never yours to heal, not out of bitterness, but because your peace is too valuable to trade for someone else's comfort. And when you stand in that kind of silence, the one rooted in truth, you're no longer just surviving, you're awakening. If this message speaks to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more Stoic wisdom that helps you reclaim your peace. The message came through like it always did, sharply worded, laced with accusation, disguised as concern. You've changed. The words weren't meant as observation. They were ammunition. A last attempt to pull her back into a role she no longer wanted to play, the role of the fixer, the pleaser, the version of herself that kept peace at the cost of her own voice. But this time she didn't respond. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared differently now. That shift is everything. It's the silent evolution that begins when you start practicing Stoicism in the heart of chaos. People often confuse detachment with coldness, but they are worlds apart. Coldness is built on resentment. Detachment, as the Stoics teach, is built on reason. It doesn't seek to punish. It simply refuses to drown in someone else's storm. In toxic relationships, the line between love and obligation becomes blurred. You're told that if you distance yourself, it means you're heartless, that if you stop trying, you've given up on them. But Stoicism shows us that stepping back isn't giving up. It's waking up. It's understanding that emotional closeness without mutual respect is a trap, not a virtue. True connection cannot survive in imbalance. Epictetus said, when someone is properly grounded in life, they shouldn't have to look outside themselves for approval. Yet toxic relationships thrive on this exact need for approval, validation, acceptance. When you detach, you stop feeding that loop. You stop offering your mind as a mirror for someone else's insecurity. You stop letting your worth be negotiated by someone who benefits from your self-doubt. For a long time, he believed that being available, endlessly forgiving, always listening, made him the better person. But slowly, he began to see that this wasn't kindness. It was erasure. He had become a background character in his own life. Every act of self-sacrifice, every swallowed truth, chipped away at his sense of identity. Until he read a line from Marcus Aurelius, "You don't have to turn this into something. It doesn't have to upset you." It felt like a door opening, not outwards, but inwards. Stoicism teaches us that detachment is not the absence of feeling. It's the presence of control. It's looking at your emotions, not through a lens of fear or panic, but through calm observation. Why does this person's anger still shake me? Why does their silence still hurt? These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of your humanity. But the Stoic doesn't drown in emotion. He stands beside it and studies the tide. When you begin to detach, you start seeing patterns you once excused. You recognize manipulation not as confusion, but as strategy. You see guilt tripping for what it is, control wrapped in concern. And that's when the clarity sharpens. You realize that their chaos is not your calling. Their mood swings are not your responsibility. Their inability to love gently is not a reflection of your worth. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when your nervous system starts to relax in their presence, not because they've changed, but because you have. You no longer react to the triggers. You no longer crave their approval. You become a still mountain in the face of emotional weather. That's Stoicism, not the denial of feeling, but the refusal to be governed by it. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." Detachment is a form of bravery. The bravery to live without constant reassurance, the courage to accept that some people will misread your silence as arrogance, your peace as indifference, but that's their lens, not your truth. The Stoic knows that virtue doesn't need applause. It stands on its own. She stopped explaining herself, not out of anger, but because she realized the explanations were never heard. They were only used to twist, to gaslight, to undermine. Now, she lets her choices speak. She knows that stepping back doesn't make her heartless. It makes her wise. She chooses peace over performance, dignity over dysfunction. And here's what people don't tell you. Detachment doesn't make you care less. It helps you care better. You no longer pour your empathy into a void. You save it for those who can hold it with respect. You no longer waste your kindness trying to soften someone who thrives on sharp edges. You offer it where it can grow, not where it's used as a weapon. Detachment is not walking away with bitterness. It's walking away without bending, without begging. It's saying, "I will not shrink myself to fit a story I never agreed to write." And in doing so, you stop being a character in someone else's chaos and start becoming the author of your own peace. He used to feel exhausted by 10 a.m., And it wasn't the work. It wasn't the lack of sleep. It was the constant emotional effort, replaying old conversations in his head, anticipating the next shift in mood, wondering if the silence meant something, or if it was just another unspoken punishment. By noon, he wasn't tired. He was drained. And the worst part was, he couldn't even explain why. The exhaustion wasn't visible, but it was real. And it had a name: emotional theft. Toxic relationships don't just hurt, they take. They pull your attention, your presence, your peace, and feed on it until there's nothing left for yourself. But Stoicism offers something radically different. It offers reclamation, the idea that your attention is yours, your thoughts are yours, your emotional energy doesn't belong to anyone else unless you give it away. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius reminds us, the things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Yet in toxic dynamics, your thoughts are rarely your own. They're hijacked by loops of second-guessing, overanalyzing, and emotional micromanagement. You start to think for the other person. You edit yourself in real time. You worry more about how they'll interpret your silence than how that silence is slowly eating at you. That is the theft, not of things, but of sovereignty. The Stoics believed that the only thing truly within our power is our mind, our judgments, our reactions, our decisions. Everything else is external, even love, even rejection, even someone's opinion of us. And once you accept that, you begin to see clearly what's been leaking energy from your life. You see the conversations you have in your own head with someone who isn't even present. You see the way one text can change your whole mood, and you start to ask the question the Stoic always asks: is this within my control? A woman once told her therapist, "I feel like I'm living on a stage, always performing for someone who isn't even clapping." That image stayed with her for weeks. The emotional labor of trying to keep someone satisfied, trying to prevent conflict, trying to stay one step ahead. It was draining her spirit. And yet, she feared what would happen if she stopped. If she just let go. But Stoicism doesn't ask you to let go blindly. It asks you to let go of the illusion that you control what you don't. You cannot make someone love you with consistency. You cannot force someone to respect you. But you can stop offering your energy to someone who misuses it. That shift doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. Seneca said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And emotional depletion is the most silent kind of waste. You don't realize it's happening until one day, even your joy feels heavy. That's when the Stoic path becomes not just relevant, but necessary. It becomes a strategy for survival, and then for thriving. She began to write down her emotional transactions at the end of each day. Where did I spend my thoughts today? Who took up the most space in my mind? Was it someone who adds to me, or someone who subtracts from me? That practice, simple as it was, changed everything. Not overnight, but slowly, the way sunlight breaks through thick clouds. She started to notice that most of her fatigue wasn't physical. It was the cost of giving too much of herself to someone who only took. Stoicism encourages self-discipline, not as punishment, but as preservation. You begin to withdraw, not because you're angry, but because you're realigning. You choose your words more carefully. You pause before you react. You stop explaining yourself in circles to people who twist your words into knots. And that pause, that breath, is power. In relationships where control masquerades as love, reclaiming your energy feels rebellious. But it's not rebellion. It's return. A return to self, to calm, to clarity. The Stoics never said don't feel. They said feel, but don't be ruled. When someone drains you, you are not weak for noticing. You are wise for responding. And it is a response, not a reaction. That's the Stoic difference. A toxic partner thrives on your emotional chaos. Your confusion keeps the game alive. But your calm, your still grounded presence, dismantles that cycle. It shifts the power, not by force, but by absence. You stop showing up to battles that don't belong to you. That's the heart of this truth. Your energy is a resource, not infinite, not disposable. When you reclaim it, you are not abandoning others. You are returning to yourself. And in that return, you rediscover the most Stoic truth of all. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you protect. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the door. He simply said, "I'm not having this conversation again." Then he stood up, walked away, and left the words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire he refused to feed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel guilty for ending the discussion. He felt sovereign, not cruel, not cold, just clear. This is what boundaries look like when they're born from Stoicism. Not aggressive, not defensive, simply firm and quiet. The kind of firmness that says, I know who I am, and I know what I will no longer tolerate. In toxic relationships, the idea of boundaries often gets twisted. You're told they're selfish, that they're walls, that you're the problem for protecting your peace. But Stoic boundaries are not made of brick. They're made of self-respect. They don't isolate, they clarify. They don't punish, they preserve. Marcus Aurelius ruled over one of the most powerful empires in history, yet he constantly wrote to himself, reminding his mind to remain steady, to not be swayed by praise or insult. He knew that without inner discipline, even a king becomes a servant to ego, to emotion, to the noise of the crowd. That's what toxic people count on, your inconsistency. They want to know that with enough pressure, you'll bend. With enough guilt, you'll fold. But the Stoic doesn't fold. He doesn't scream either. He simply draws a line and doesn't step over it, even when begged. Boundaries, when rooted in Stoic wisdom, are not ultimatums. They are standards. They come not from wounded pride, but from inner clarity. Seneca once wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving." That's not elitism. That's alignment. You don't have to stay where you're constantly shrinking just to keep the peace. For years, she avoided confrontation. She thought saying no meant being difficult, that setting limits meant being hard to love. So she said yes to everything, every demand, every mood swing, every unspoken rule. And slowly, she vanished. Until one night, after another unnecessary apology, she sat alone and whispered aloud, "What am I apologizing for?" That's when the shift began. The Stoic shift, the awareness that you can choose your inner circle, not based on obligation or guilt, but on values, on reciprocity, on growth. Boundaries are an act of love, but not just for others, for yourself. The Stoic doesn't seek to change others, only to remain unchanged by what doesn't align with virtue. You don't build boundaries to keep people out. You build them to keep your soul intact. There's a story told about a philosopher who was asked why he always remained calm when others tried to provoke him. He replied, "Because I don't open every door someone knocks on." That's the essence of boundary work. You don't owe access to everyone who demands it. Your time, your energy, your attention, these are gifts, not entitlements. When someone calls you selfish for setting a limit, it's often because they were benefiting from your lack of one. But the Stoic knows, it is better to disappoint with truth than to exhaust yourself with compliance. A clear boundary is not a threat. It's a mirror. It reflects what you value, and it silently invites others to rise or walk away. She stopped explaining her choices. She stopped defending her time. She learned that the more she honored her limits, the more peace she felt. Not because the people around her changed, but because she no longer handed them the keys to her emotional space. And that space, that calm, sacred space, became the soil for healing. Boundaries are not just verbal, they are energetic. They are the look in your eyes when someone crosses a line and you don't flinch, but you also don't entertain it. They are the silence after a manipulative comment, the phone call you don't answer, the message you leave unread, not out of spite, but out of wisdom. The Stoic king is not guarded, he is grounded. He chooses his battles carefully. He listens more than he speaks. And when he speaks, it carries weight, not because he raises his voice, but because his voice comes from principle, not impulse. This kind of presence makes manipulators uncomfortable. It disarms passive aggression. It dissolves drama, because it can't find a hook. The hook was always your reactivity, your desire to explain, to fix, to rescue. But now, your stillness speaks louder than your words ever did. And maybe for the first time, you start to feel safe within yourself. Because the boundaries you set outside are just an expression of the strength you've cultivated inside. You no longer try to be everything for everyone. You're becoming someone solid for yourself. That is Stoicism in action. That is power without force. And that is the kind of boundary that doesn't push people away. It protects what's finally coming alive in you. She looked at herself in the mirror, not searching for flaws, but trying to find the person she used to be. The one who used to laugh without checking the room first. The one who didn't filter every word to avoid setting someone off. The one who didn't confuse survival with love. For a moment, she didn't see strength. She saw damage, a long list of things she tolerated, ignored, forgave. But then something shifted. She realized the person staring back wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. Toxic relationships don't just shake your confidence, they make you doubt your core. They wrap their dysfunction in your name until you start to forget where they end and you begin. But Stoicism brings you back, not with fanfare, not with declarations, but with quiet truths. With the radical idea that no matter what you've endured, your mind is still yours, your character is still yours, and those are the only things you ever truly needed to be whole. Marcus Aurelius said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." That sentence becomes a lifeline when your self-worth has been chewed through by years of walking on emotional glass. You realize that the story someone wrote about you, the one where you're too much, too sensitive, never enough, it's not your story, it's theirs, and you can stop acting in it. Rebuilding after toxicity isn't loud. It's not a sudden sunrise, it's slow, like muscle retraining after injury. Some days you'll feel strong, other days, the wind of a single word might knock you sideways. But the Stoic doesn't measure progress in applause. He measures it in alignment. Did I act in accordance with my values today? Did I stay present? Did I return to myself when my thoughts wanted to spiral? There's a power in knowing you can feel everything and still remain rooted. That you can carry memories without letting them define you. That your scars are not signs of weakness, but evidence that you survived what should have broken you. The Stoics would never call you broken. They would call you tested, tempered, forged. Epictetus himself was born a slave, physically crippled, and yet taught generations about freedom. Not the kind granted by others, but the kind you give yourself when you stop letting your circumstances define your spirit. He believed that true freedom came from mastering your own mind, your own responses, and in that mastery, we find peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the absence of surrender to what is beneath us. You are not broken because you cried, because you stayed too long, because you believed in someone who couldn't meet you there. That doesn't make you weak. It means you had hope. You had love to give. The Stoics never discouraged love. They simply refused to let it unseat reason. They understood that love without wisdom is fire without control. It warms until it burns you to ash. But here you are. Ashes maybe, but not destroyed. The Stoic transformation isn't about becoming numb. It's about becoming unshakable. A mountain still gets rained on, but it doesn't move. A lighthouse still gets hit by storms, but it keeps shining. That's you now. Less reactive, more rooted, less desperate for validation, more anchored in values no one can twist. He once wrote himself a note, after years of being told he was too closed off, too passive, too selfish for setting limits. He wrote, "I am not too much. I am just not for everyone, and I don't have to be." That wasn't defiance, it was clarity. The kind Stoicism gives you after enough reflection. You begin to understand that your worth is not on trial, not anymore. When you return to yourself after a toxic bond, there's grief. Grief for the time lost, for the self you muted. But there's also birth. A new standard rises. A new voice speaks inside you, not the anxious one, always bracing, but the calm one, the one that speaks slowly and watches more than it reacts. That voice is your compass now. And yes, there will still be echoes, a text that tightens your chest, a dream that reminds you of old wounds. But Stoicism doesn't promise a clean slate. It promises strength through reality. You don't need to erase the past, you just need to stop letting it write your future. You are not broken. You are learning how to live without betraying yourself. You are learning how to love without losing yourself. You are learning how to stay kind without staying silent. You are learning how to be free. That's not just healing, that's transformation. That's the birth of someone unshakable. And that someone is you. If this message resonated with you, consider subscribing for more Stoic reflections like this one. Leave a like if you felt seen or supported, and drop a simple thank you in the comments if you're on this journey too. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can say is simply that we're still standing.